Howdy, and welcome to a special episode of T-Shirts and Shawls. I will probably list this as episode 76, but I'm just going to tell you up front, this is not a full episode. This is an announcement. And it's an announcement that contains some potentially bad news, so I'm just going to rip off the Band-Aid and tell you what it is, and then explain. So basically, I need to take an extended break from the podcast. This extended break could be a permanent break. I haven't 100% decided if it's just going to be a very long break, which means probably several months, definitely all the way through the summer. So we're looking at least 3 or 4 months, maybe longer, or it might be the end of the podcast. So why? I love you guys. I love this community and I love talking to you, but I am realizing that I can't do everything that I've been doing. It's getting to the point where I'm exhausted all the time, and I'm getting to the point where I know I'm going to reach burnout, and I'm afraid of what that might look like if I let it happen. And there are things that I don't want to give up. I don't want to give up Roundtable Yarns. Yes, there are times where I think, it'd be so much nicer if I could just not have to worry about this business all the time and just be a regular knitter. But I know myself, and I know I would probably start up another business at some point after that. So why do that when I've got something that I actually love? But I know if I continue on at the pace that I'm currently on, that things will probably crash and burn. So I have to let go of some things. And unfortunately, the podcast is the thing that I think I need to let go of, starting with. So the reasons for that, part of it is the time it takes to record the podcast. It is almost a full day project. It's an hour-long podcast usually, so it takes me over an hour to record it, because there's starts and stops in between the segments, and then I edit it and I upload it and I write the show notes and I post, I make all the graphics and post, and basically it eats up an entire day. And you're thinking probably, but it's one day every other week. Is that really that much time? And really, it's not so much the time that it takes to do the actual recording. It's kind of the headspace that the podcast takes every other day. So to kind of explain that, I am always thinking about the podcast. Whenever I'm working on something, when I'm knitting, I'm thinking, I need to remember this. I need to write this down so I can remember to talk about it on the podcast. Or I need to do such and such about the podcast, think about the podcast. I practice saying things that I'm going to tell you guys. I practice in the shower, I practice in the car, sometimes just walking around the house, I'm like talking to you guys. Sometimes it's segments that I do eventually record as part of the podcast, and sometimes it's things that I just talk through, and then don't ever end up actually on camera. So the podcast is constantly on my mind. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, the thing that I love the most is the community and talking to you guys, and I hate to give that up. But I've realized that because of wanting to have things to say, to share with you guys, some of the choices and decisions I've made about what I'm knitting, about how I spend my time, are made with thoughts of the podcast in mind. I am approaching the 3rd anniversary of the podcast, so this has been kind of front and center for 3 years of my life, and I've realized that there are some knitting projects that I've decided not to work on because I didn't think that they would be that interesting to talk about. And even some that I have, like Boxy, which is just stockinette over and over and over again. It's kind of boring to hold it up and say, hey, look, I've got another inch of stockinette done. So that's not really very interesting. And so I think that I have made decisions on what I'm making based on what I think would be interesting to talk about. And I don't think that I am always consciously making those decisions, but it definitely is a subconscious thought for the past 3 years that I need to work on something that will be interesting to talk about. I also have felt like I need to do a lot of knitting, so that way I have plenty to talk about, so I can actually show you progress on projects, so that it's not just, well, I only knit on this one project the past 2 weeks, and so here you go, and I don't have much to say about it. So I have really amped up my knitting time to be able, again, to have something to talk about. And that's not bad in and of itself. I love knitting. I love spending my time knitting. But I'm realizing that I'm doing it by making that choice of really prioritizing knitting. There are other things that I have not been doing as much of. I have not been reading as much. And I think I've talked about that struggle on the podcast. And even when I do sit down and read, I feel like I can't just read. Like I need to have the book open in front of me, and then I also need to be knitting. Part of it is in graduate school, we were kind of taught that you should always be working, and that free time was just, you should not have free time because academia is such a publisher perish type of field that you have to work hard in order to be successful. So you need to work all the time to get that. And so I don't know really how to be idle, to just have time where all I am doing is focusing on one thing. Even when I'm knitting, I am listening to an audiobook or a podcast or watching TV. I'm multitasking even my hobbies. And I really can't remember the last time I just sat down with a book, and instead of knitting for an hour or two, I just read for an hour or two. My reading is in fits and spurts that I've got 10 minutes here and I read a little, and 15 minutes there, and it doesn't really allow me to get in a book, but I feel guilty when I'm reading and not doing something else. And that's not just the podcast. I do want to make it clear. I also want to make it clear that none of you have ever pressured me into any of this. This is all my own internal thoughts and feelings. If this were a breakup letter, this would be the line where I say, it's me, not you. But I do want to make that clear. Nobody has ever said anything or pressured me into feeling like I have to do a ton of knitting and to pick interesting things to talk about. It all is coming from myself internally. Anyway, so I feel like I can't allow myself to maybe not do as much knitting. I would never give up knitting. Knitting is my thing, and I know what happens to me if I don't knit. But perhaps just pulling back a little bit. For instance, this morning, or actually most mornings, I usually get my coffee and I knit, and that is what I do to wake up each day before everyone else in the house gets up. And since I got back from Plyaway, I've actually spent some of that morning time journaling. I've been using that pen that I got at the pen store at Plyaway, and I've been journaling. And then if I have time after that, then I do a little bit of knitting. But I haven't journaled in not consistently in ages, and that I think is really helping me. It kind of helped me come to the realization of needing to take a break from the podcast. I definitely journaled about that quite a bit. So that has been helping me, but that means that it's less time for knitting. I still make sure that I do some knitting at some other point during the day if I haven't had time in the morning. But this morning, I finished my journaling, and I had almost an hour. I got up pretty early this morning. And instead of knitting, I decided, you know what, I want to read. And so I let myself read for that hour, and it felt, and just read, just sit there with a book and just read. It felt so good. Part of me felt guilty because if you can't tell, I'm actually recording this right after I recorded the previous episode of the podcast. I'm still wearing the same shirt, though I'm not airing it the same time. I'm waiting a little bit before I air this. And so part of me felt guilty because it's a podcast recording day. I'm going to talk about how I'm almost done with Boxy, and maybe if I spend this hour picking up the stitches on that second sleeve and getting started, then I can show you guys that I made that progress. And I thought, you know what? No, this morning I feel like what I should be doing is reading. And I had already, made the decision that to take a break from the podcast, and so I felt like it was okay to not do that knitting this morning and not have that update to share with you, and to read instead. It kind of honestly was a sense of relief. Again, it is not you. This is all internalized pressure that I have put on myself. And so what I really need is just the headspace, not just the time that it takes to record the podcast, but the headspace that I have used to think about the podcast, which, like I said, is practically on a daily basis that I'm thinking about what I'm going to talk about. So I want to get that headspace back, and I want to see what happens when I don't have to feel like my knitting life is so performative, that it is so public that I'm sharing. I still post things on Instagram, and if you are looking, you're thinking, oh, how am I gonna keep up with you? Instagram is probably gonna be the best way to do that. I'll put a link to my Instagram, and I guess I'll do a show note for this. It's Karen Dawn Knits. All one word. Karen Dawn Knits is my Instagram. So that would probably be the best place to follow me, to see kind of updates on what I'm working on. But I don't want to worry so much about that public side of my knitting. I want to just, again, for my own headspace, I want to relax and maybe do some other things. We used to spend quite a bit of time playing board games, me and Luke and my husband, and we really haven't been doing that as much lately. And not just because of the podcast. I mean, there are other reasons. And I want to devote more time to be able to do things like that again. And I just need a kind of a shift in some priorities and thinking. And that does mean, again, not giving up on knitting, because that is the core of who I am, but pulling back on it a little bit and maybe making it not be so central to everything that I'm doing and thinking, which means that I wouldn't really have much to talk about in episodes. Yes, I know I talk about what I'm reading and other things I'm doing, but this still very much is a knitting podcast. Yeah, I'm kind of going on and on and on for the basically the same point. I just need to let my head rest from thinking about what I'm going to share on the podcast. So it might be a rest that after a few months I decide, okay, I'm ready to get back to it. I'm missing the podcast, and I'm really wanting that back in my life. Or it may be this feels good to not have to worry about how I'm going to fill up an hour and what I'm going to say. So I don't know which side I'm gonna come down on. But I wanted to give you guys a heads up and an explanation and talk about kind of what's going through my head. There's a really big thing, a really big idea that I've had for a while that I really want to pursue. But I just haven't, because, it's something else to occupy my time. So maybe clearing up this headspace and this time will allow me to pursue that idea. I don't know. I kind of want to just see what life is like without being a podcast host for a while. Again, the most important thing about the podcast to me is you guys. So I want to make it clear that that although I might not be showing up in your YouTube feed every other week, I still want to be part of your life. So I already mentioned Instagram, Karen Dawn Knits. That is going to be the best place to keep up with what I'm knitting and what I'm dyeing. I am not going to close the podcast group on Ravelry, so definitely come over there. We still have the quarterly knit along going on. I'm not going to end that prematurely. I'm going to keep that going through the end of June. So please, continue on with that quarterly knit along. We'll definitely finish out this quarter. And, come over and talk. I want to keep the community aspect. It's just the getting on video, getting on camera every other week and talking for an hour aspect that I need to cut out. So I don't want to cut the community out. I don't want to cut you out. So please come to the Ravelry group. Please go to Instagram. That's where you will be able to keep up with what I'm doing. And hopefully just with continued journaling and continued doing other things and other focuses, I'll just feel like I'm in a better headspace. I feel like that's really needed. So that is a big announcement, and thank you guys so much for your support over the past 3 years of the podcast. I definitely would not have kept doing this without you guys. You are the entire reason why I have been doing this. So again, but you are not to blame. Nobody's pressured me. It's completely all on myself. But you guys are really the greatest podcast audience that I could have asked for. You've been so supportive, and I love chatting with you guys. So let's keep that up, even though I'm not going to be coming out on video. Okay, so I'm going to end this because I could just keep going on and on about this, and I hopefully have gotten the main idea across. So hopefully I will see you around on Ravelry and Instagram. Happy knitting!